Gwynny cór ar an gédal sias míle buchas as an fircin fóilse. Is privilege féin seas trí slím le ambassador na héirin das na náisiúnta Geraldine Byrne as an méid aber atá déanta agus a gohoirithe an násca tá chuir in áit aici leis na Hanada os na tíre den America Haas agus America Lór. That is the language as I spoke it in our own language, but may I say what a great pleasure it is to be here. And I have also to say to my queridos amigos de America, Sur America Central, me gusta mucho estar aquí. And it's very, very great pleasure to be here. This house is a very interesting house in relation to not just matters Latin American or Central American. It has been a house of hospitalidad, of hospitality. It is some of the most important changes and figures in the world. Kevin Cahill was as Master said, was a friend of mine. He's been a friend of mine for many years. He's one of the most distinguished Irish Americans abroad. I was saying to one of his sons, I think 15 years ago, he was described as having worked in 65 countries in the world. Working with the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, where he developed some of his skills. But most of us who know him as somebody who has been a friend, who has, I think I said a few evenings ago, there were only about 3 or 4 refugee camps in the world that weren't aware of Kevin Cahill's work. And that is an extraordinary commitment. And he was a particular friend of somebody of Miguel de Soto Brockman, who was, of course, president of the General Assembly. And that is in a way where I think I spent most of my own personal connections with Central and South America. But it goes back. When I was a postgraduate student in the United States in the 1960s, at a certain time of the Easter break, and graduate students from the United States would head to Fort Lauderdale. And I just happened to be sharing accommodation with 2 friends from Mexico who said to me, why don't you come home with us? And I traveled across the United States, and I went into Mexico for the first time in 1966 at Nuevo Laredo, and then I proceeded on to visit Mexico and Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta, which that time had 1 posado. It has much changed. But after my visits to Mexico 52 years ago, I realized that there was something extraordinary happens to you when you are in that continent. And now I'm of course I'm ignoring my speech, but let me say it's mucho más importante hablar del corazón. It is so much more important to speak from the heart. And I think that anyone... I think that Ireland's connection with Latin America is a very interesting one and a complicated one, and one that I often had difficulties in explaining to people. Many of you are from the islands, for example, from the islands of Barbados and others. That's one particular connection, because there is a very large influx of Irish after the fall of the Cromwellian destructive and terrible, vicious occupation of Ireland led to deportations of Irish after the fall of Drogheda in 1641. Many, many thousands of Irish were exiled to Barbados. Was a clearinghouse for many of the islands. Many years later, in 1986, I was asked to make a documentary for Channel 4 on the Irish connection with Montserrat. And that was quite much more controversial, because I was able to point out to some Irish who might not want to have heard it, that they had owned estates in the tobacco period of the Caribbean. It was in fact actually quite a tradition that I was mayor of Galway, alcalde, twice, and it was a tradition in the 17th century that the second son of the mayor would go off to make a fortune in the Caribbean. And thus you got names like Blakes, Lynches, Kerwins, all of these which are spread out through the Caribbean. But after, of course, tobacco came sugar. and with sugar came slavery. And therefore, what the relationship with Ireland would have been from originally investment in tobacco, but now some also were not, they were indentured servants, where you signed up for, you were promised, the most interesting thing, you were promised in the tobacco period that at the end of your indentured service you would be given 3 acres of land, a suit of clothes, and £5. But then, as in fact the sugar intensity brought with not only slavery, but also it made land very valuable, so all of those indentured contracts fell. And thus you would have had Irish names as drivers on the plantations during the sugar period. Now you can imagine it was quite controversial making a film about this, and actually at a time when people had particular versions of their history and so forth. But I felt it was all necessary to put it in because it was something that was very important. Many of the people who would, for example, after the Christianizing exercises in Central and South America, after the abolition of slavery, would take the names of Irish servants, and there was much intermarriage and so forth. All of this was in my background in a way. But when I was a member of Parliament then, and because I was interested in the Derechos Humanos, it was in, I think, in rather difficult times in Salvador in 1981. I visited Salvador during the military period. General Garcia signed an order suggesting that I wasn't welcome at the time because I intended to write about the massacre at Morazan. And there I began to meet people who were suffering greatly. I visited refugee camps in Honduras, and then also many cases later. There was something wonderful happening. There was something stirring in Latin America. It was a time of a great adventure, and Central America of great prospects and and of great hope. The Medellin documents had come out about the option for the poor. And I think when I'm back, if there isn't structure to what I'm saying, it is because there's so much of it, but I cannot talk to you about it all. But visiting Salvador, for example, after the funeral of Oscar Romero, who himself in turn had been in fact converted to the option for the poor after the murder of his dear friend Padre Rutillo. And then after that, it was after I had in fact actually been refused admission to Salvador that I nominated the country I wanted to visit was Nicaragua. And it was at Nicaragua I met for the first time Miguel de Soto Brockman, and I met and therefore developed a connection with Nicaragua, which has continued to this day, and that is why I'm so delighted that Maria Chamorro is here with us and so on. So friends of mine had been visiting, and later I would go down. I found myself for different reasons in Chile, and I was observador uno to the plebiscito in Chile. I observed the plebiscito from Punta Arenas with Archbishop Gonzalez and others. And of course I visited many of your other countries as well. The Argentinian, I'm the representative of Argentina. I accompanied Mary Robinson I was the accompanying minister in her visit to this presidential visit to Argentina. But also what was very, very interesting, I think, was the old connection that was there. I am not related, it's a different branch of the family of the O'Higginses, Ambrosio. Because Ambrosio represents, if you like, that period in Irish Latin American history where he's the representative of the king. But it is to Ambrosio's credit very, very much. It is that the first question is that he, in that constitution which he wrote, he abolished racial distinction, and also he put a very severe rein in relation to ecclesiastical privileges. Of course, it would be Bernardo O'Higgins, Libertador, Fundador of Chile, who would in fact have a different view as he crossed the Andes. So I say all of this because it gives me such pleasure to be in the company of people from Latin and Central America. And I remember well hearing all those different versions of El Condor Pasar. And then eventually, over most recent, before I became president, I was in fact in Colombia. And really speaking there I had visited because I knew I was visited in Buenaventura, visiting Las Familias de los Desaparecidos, the families of the disappeared, and particularly what was happening in relation in relation to false fugitives and what it was doing to the families. I say all of this to say then, to summarise to some extent, there is a very old connection between Ireland and Latin America. It gets intense from the period about the middle of the 17th century on. And Irish people, after they had been excluded from participation, the fall of the Gaelic order in the first decades of the 17th century, went and served in the armies of the different European administrations, and many of them made their way to South America. Many others then, after that period, identifying with the natural instinct and aspiration for republicanism and freedom of the people, they would become, for example, Florence McCarthy, who would have been the first Adjutant General assistant of Simon Bolivar. And then you would have, in addition, the others, there were the people who in Mexico paid a huge price by changing sides, the San Patricio Brigade. And then you have others in relation. Daniel O'Connell, the liberator in Ireland, sent his son to work with Bolivar. And again, others from the Irish Republican movement sent people to work with different emancipatory tendencies in Latin America. That is a rich history, but it's something I say to Irish people regularly. It's something we should have made so much more of long before now, because the future is one where there are great opportunities for us in relation to cooperate together. Ireland is a member of the European Union with a totally different history than the countries with imperialist tendency. It can be available as a bridge from Latin American, South American, Caribbean countries to the European Union. But it's very interesting, I often think about it, is that there are other strains. There were the Irish missionary orders who worked. There was a great dispute in the papacy at one stage as to who had responsibility for the Caribbean. Was it to be the Jesuits or the Franciscans? And some of the best evidence we have is in relation to the history of the orders now becoming available. But we have actually begun to repair these omissions we've been making, because you'll see the book on the way in. And I do want to say to Conor McEnroe and others, all those who have been assisted, Los Paisanos, which is there. Because, of course, Eliza Lynch is, of course, very, very important. But so many others. When I think about it as well, it was very interesting about people. I remember attending an interparliamentary union in Havana, and the rains came and so forth. And the big difference between the Irish and the people and the Latinos who were there was very much is that they began to dance. No one was a bit worried at all, and I think that was good. I think we have shared relationships in the present. I think we're delighted. I pay tribute to the ambassador for having been able to assemble you all here this evening on the occasion of the visit of the President of Ireland. It's a great privilege to meet. It's a great privilege to meet you all. And I also want to say that I'm very, very concerned as well. That continent, in many cases, has kept itself nuclear free. Ireland's relationship with the continent in the future. And indeed, when Ireland, as let's be speaking frankly, hopes to speak as a small nation in the Security Council, it does so given the background that I have described, but also to know that the future of our planet. When I think, for example, of the conversations I've had, indeed, I had a visit from Eva Morales, in which we discussed issues of ecology, issues of the indigenous people. I visited with Sabina, myself, Costa Rica, with its wonderful achievements in relation to ecological responsibility. Allowed to do so with the great, unhelpful, often doctrinaire views of the great powers. This continent is capable of being the heart of the world, keeping itself nuclear free. And then as well as that, as I tried to point out in my own speech in the United Nations, we have to talk about a recovered symmetry in our world, what in Bolivia they would call Tierra Madre, But I think we need to be able to put together ecology, economy, culture, belief systems, respect for indigeneity and so on, and respect for the seas, respect for all of all of these things. I had been describing my rather curious relationship, but it was one of the reasons where, since I became president, I've been to 9 countries in, say, South and Central America. I wish I had more time to visit many more because I have a long list. But I think that one of the things that we do share is this. The paisano, the citizens of this part of the world and the citizens of Ireland share something. They share the experience of what it is to have to throw off the yoke of colonization. But it's much more than anything negative like that. It's about the positive right to be able to define your people in terms of their needs and in terms of what they need most. I remember when the people in the village of Oscar Romero in Salvador, there was a very formal ecclesiastical thing after the funeral. But the people in the village, of his own village and in Rodillo's village, wanted to do something. And they spoke about el obispo que anda con la gente, the bishop who walked the path with the poor, and so on. And those great documents that came out in the option for the poor, and how wonderful it is to hear Pope Francis recalling them now, and also welcoming back into la Iglesia de los Pobres, the people who were excluded. I think that is just so important. What it offered us was a different kind of new international economic order, something that would respect dignity, something that would address what I think Javier Gorostiaga used to write about, was a civilization of sufficiency, where we would meet the needs of our people. That is why you honour me as President of Ireland by your presence here this evening, and I thank you for having accepted the invitation of the Ambassador of Ireland. I want to say to you that you will find Ireland to be a friend, and indeed, I hope, a friend too, that doesn't use words, but as it walks the words into the representation of your interests in the Security Council. There is I am technically, I suppose, Supreme Commander of the Forces. We have a representative of the forces here. He and his colleagues, for the last 60 years, there has been no time. There aren't 1,000 Irish men and women serving in different places. I watched them myself at the end of the peace process, the Arias peace process in Nicaragua, where the Contra and the Nicaraguan troops, my friends, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, were within actually 100 yards of each other. And the commander said to the Irish, only the Irish could do this so well and so peacefully. And thus when mandates are offered in the United Nations, the Irish is right at the top of the list as people who are able to read both the uniqueness and the necessary dignities that are associated with people in locations of conflict. That is a contribution that Ireland can make as a small country. There is no such thing as a small country. There should be no such thing as a small country in the United Nations. And what this week has been all about has been about how we must resist with every fibre of our being the suggestion that we can have this kind of conversation I've had now at the General Assembly. We could have had it with Pedro Miguel and with others, but that it doesn't belong in the Security Council. It has to go into the Security Council, and it will be in the Security Council. Bolivia uses its voice, others uses its voice, and Ireland will use its voice, and I think that that is very, very important. I think as well as that, in relation to the bigger issues, you said I was introduced by the ambassador as interested in human rights. One of the most shocking things to me is that why, with all of the science and technology, when I look at the unexploded ordnance that is spread around the world, the allocation, I think, for it is about 180 million to continue this important work. There are parts of our planet that cannot be used by the people who use them for their livelihoods because of unexploded ordnance. And when I came, of course, I remember when I would pick up those first pamphlets in the 1980s, and those very long speeches that the Sandinistas used to give at different times. And we wondered about what the appalling arrogance it was of the Dulles brothers to imagine that they could resist and overthrow and undermine tendencies towards democracy and attempts to meet the needs of the people in countries that had their own instincts and their own right to be free. So it is all about that freedom. Now, how are we to use that freedom? We use it now as the time as well for countries like Ireland and Europe to be friends of Central and South America in times of great turbulence. But those great turbulences will pass, and people will dance again, and people will sing again, and people will in fact then realise in many cases that it will be one of the most beautiful parts, non-militarised, in this planet in which to live and be. And people like Conor and others knows what a life one can have in many cases when people are operating, as I said, not out of the coldness of the mind, but are also listening to the music of the heart. Thank you for your patience in listening to me, and may I express my deep personal gratitude and my gratitude as President of Ireland for you all coming along to have this very, very special evening with us. Muchas gracias.